It was exactly 3:07 a.m. when the first knock shattered the silence of our hallway. Not a gentle tap, not even a regular knock. It was sharp, heavy, and filled with authority, like someone wanted the whole street to hear. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. The house was dark, the air cold, and the only sound was the ceiling fan clicking above my head. Then came the second knock, louder, angrier, followed by a deep voice that made the walls vibrate. HOA security! Open up immediately! My heart jumped. HOA security? At 3 a.m.? That didn't make sense. Our neighborhood was calm, almost boring. The HOA was the kind of group that sent emails about garbage bins left out too long or grass growing too high. Not a team that showed up before dawn pounding on doors. I turned to my mom, who was sitting up beside me, her face pale in the dim light. She didn't say a word, she just listened. Outside, footsteps crunched on the gravel, slow and deliberate. We crept toward the living room window. Through the blinds, I saw them. 3 men, dressed in dark uniforms, their badges glinting under the yellow porch light. One had a clipboard in his hand, just like a real inspector, and another carried what looked like a radio clipped to his vest. But something was off. Their uniforms didn't match. The badges looked shiny but cheap. And the one holding the radio wasn't even pressing any buttons. He was pretending. My stomach turned. The tallest man scanned our house like a hunter stalking prey. He leaned toward the door and spoke again. "This is an urgent HOA matter. Open up now before we take further action." Mom gasped softly. "This isn't right," she whispered. "The HOA doesn't send people like that. Not in the middle of the night." Before I could respond, a low, calm voice came from the hallway behind us. He wasn't startled. He wasn't panicking. He was calm, too calm. "Stay down," he whispered. "Don't make a sound." Something in his tone made me obey instantly. He didn't sound like a man reacting to danger. He sounded like someone trained for it. Dad disappeared into the shadows, barefoot and silent. I barely saw him move, just the faint outline of his shoulders as he slipped down the hallway like a shadow. The knocks grew harder. One of the men rattled the doorknob. The house trembled with every hit. From the kitchen came a faint metallic click, a drawer opening, then closing. I knew that sound. Dad had gone for the safe. My mom reached for her phone, but there was no signal. None. The Wi-Fi symbol was gone. Even the landline gave only a dull static hiss. It hit us both at the same time. They'd probably jammed the signal. My chest tightened. Who were these men? Through the blinds, I watched one whisper to another, his hand hovering near his belt. They weren't talking to dispatch. They weren't recording anything. They were waiting. For what? I didn't know. Then, the porch light flickered, once, twice, before going out completely. Total darkness. That's when fear truly set in. My mom grabbed my arm, trembling. They cut the power. In that pitch-black silence, I could hear only our breathing, and the faint, deliberate steps of my father moving through the house like a ghost. He had once been a Navy SEAL, though he rarely talked about it. But that night, I saw the soldier in him return. The steady, silent focus. The readiness. The awareness that every second could change everything. He took position near the doorway, crouched low, voice barely above a whisper. "They're testing the locks. Stay behind me." And as the metallic click of the lockpick echoed through the night, Dad's eyes, calm, unblinking, locked onto the door. Whatever was about to happen next would change everything. Because that night, evil came dressed as authority. And it was about to meet a man who knew the difference. The lock clicked again, louder this time. Not an accident. Not curiosity. Someone was working the door. Outside, the 3 men moved with eerie coordination. One crouched near the doorknob while another aimed a flashlight into the windows, sweeping it across the curtains like a searchlight. The third man stood back, watching, one hand resting on his hip as if daring anyone to interrupt. Through the blinds, I could see the dull metal of a handgun holstered under his jacket. My breath caught in my throat. Mom covered her mouth, eyes wide, trembling. "Oh my God," she whispered. "They're armed." But my dad didn't flinch. He stood by the front door, his back straight, One hand braced against the wall. In the faint glow of the hallway nightlight, I saw his jaw tighten, the same way it used to before he'd leave for deployment years ago. He didn't look scared. He looked ready. He turned his head just slightly and said, in a voice low and steady, "They're not here for questions. They're here for entry." That one sentence chilled me more than the knocking. The doorknob turned again, slow, testing. Then came the sound of metal scraping metal. They were picking the lock. Dad raised his finger to his lips, signaling for silence. He stepped sideways, crouched low, and with quiet precision checked the chamber of his pistol. The faint click echoed through the dark hallway. Mom pulled me closer to the stairs, whispering, "Stay behind me. Don't move." But my eyes stayed locked on Dad. He positioned himself to the side of the doorway, hidden from sight, the perfect angle for defense. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't sweating. He was calculating. Outside, the men began whispering, low, fast, nervous. One of them said something like, "Doors almost open. On 3. And that's when the air inside our house changed. You could feel it, the tension so thick it almost hummed. Then came the final shove. The door latch gave way with a crack that echoed like thunder. The tallest man stepped inside first. His uniform looked almost real. Dark shirt, black pants, a fake badge that flashed in the beam of his flashlight. "HOA inspection," he barked. "We have reports of security violations." But his voice, it didn't sound official. It sounded rehearsed, like an actor reading the wrong lines. Dad didn't answer. He waited until the man's second foot crossed the threshold. Then, in a single motion, he stepped out from the shadows, pistol raised, voice sharp and commanding. "Freeze. Identify yourself, now." The man stumbled backward, startled. His hand twitched toward his waist. And that's when Dad's training took over. He fired, not at the man, but at the floor, inches from his boots. The sound exploded through the house, shaking the walls. "Hands up!" Dad roared. "Now!" For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, one by one, the fake officers dropped their weapons, cheap airsoft guns that looked real under dim light. The one with the clipboard raised trembling hands. "Wait, wait, it's not what it looks like." Dad cut him off. "On your knees. You're done." Behind him, I saw blue and red lights flicker through the window. Neighbors had heard the gunshot. The real police were on their way. Mom finally exhaled, her voice shaking. "They were fake," she whispered. "They were actually fake." But I couldn't move. My eyes were glued to those men kneeling on our floor, the same ones who thought a fake badge and a dark uniform could give them power. They looked terrified now, stripped of their act, caught in their own lie. Dad stood over them, calm as ever, the pistol still lowered but steady. "You picked the wrong house," he said quietly. "Next time you wear a badge, make sure you've earned it." The real sirens grew louder, flooding the street with flashing lights. And for the first time that night, I realized something that would stay with me forever. Evil doesn't always break in wearing a mask. Sometimes, it knocks politely and says it's here to help. The room felt frozen in time, like every second stretched into an eternity. The fake officers knelt on the floor, their fake badges glinting under the weak glow of our hallway lamp. Outside, sirens wailed closer, but inside, the tension was thick enough to choke on. My dad kept his pistol trained on the men, eyes locked, steady as stone. He wasn't breathing hard. He wasn't yelling. He was in complete control, the kind of control that comes only from years of training under fire. "You're gonna tell me who sent you," he said, voice deep, calm, and deadly serious. "And you're gonna tell me now." The one holding the clipboard swallowed hard. His hands shook so violently the papers fluttered to the ground. We didn't mean, it's just, we were told the house was empty." "Empty?" Dad snapped. "Then why come dressed like law enforcement?" No answer. Just silence and fear. I peeked from behind the staircase, barely able to see over the railing. My mom held my arm so tight it hurt, whispering, "Don't move, sweetheart. Just stay back." But part of me couldn't look away. Because at that moment, I wasn't just seeing my dad. I was seeing the man I'd only ever heard stories about. The Navy SEAL. The man who'd gone through missions that weren't even allowed to be talked about. And now, that same man stood in our living room, barefoot, in an old t-shirt, facing 3 armed intruders without an ounce of hesitation. Outside, headlights flashed. A neighbor must have called for help. But the fake officers knew time was running out. The tallest one looked toward the door, his eyes flicking toward the window like he was planning something. My dad noticed. "Don't even think about it," he warned. But the man moved anyway, sudden, desperate, like a cornered animal. That's when it happened. Dad moved faster than I thought a human could move. He sidestepped, grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it downward in one sharp motion, a maneuver so clean it looked choreographed, and the fake gun clattered to the floor. The man yelped, pain shooting through his voice. Before the others could react, Dad had already kicked the weapon across the room and aimed his pistol squarely at the second intruder. "Hands where I can see them." The second man raised both hands, stammering, We didn't want to hurt anyone." Dad's voice dropped lower, colder. "Then why'd you come through my door at 3 a.m.? No one dared answer. Then came the flash of red and blue through the blinds. The real cops were pulling up, lights reflecting off every surface in the room. Dad didn't lower his weapon, but his tone shifted, commanding, professional, practiced. "On the ground. Face down. Interlace your fingers behind your head. Don't move until the officers tell you to." They obeyed instantly. Within seconds, the front door burst open again, this time for real. Uniformed deputies rushed in, guns drawn, shouting commands. It was chaos, lights, voices, adrenaline. "Sheriff's Department. Drop your weapon," one officer yelled. Dad immediately placed his pistol on the ground and raised his hand slowly, calm and compliant. "All clear," he said. 3 suspects, all disarmed. They were posing as HOA officers. The deputy's flashlight swept the scene, the fake badges, the cheap gear, the trembling men face down on our living room floor. One officer looked at Dad and then at me, confusion written across his face. "Sir, how did you know they weren't real?" Dad gave the faintest smile. "Because real authority doesn't show up uninvited or hide behind lies." The officer nodded. "Good instincts, sir. You just prevented a serious crime." As they cuffed the impostors and led them out into the flashing lights, I finally exhaled. My mom's hands were still trembling, but she smiled through her tears. That night, I saw what real courage looks like. Not in movies, not in stories, but in a father who didn't need to be told when to stand up for his family. Because when evil came through our door pretending to wear a badge, it met a man who'd earned the right to protect. The flashing red and blue lights painted the walls of our living room like a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. The intruders, the fake HOA cops, were face down on the floor, wrists bound in zip ties. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of sweat and fear. Outside, the street buzzed with officers, radios crackling, neighbors whispering from their porches. Some were still in pajamas, clutching coffee mugs, trying to understand what had just happened. Inside, everything was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that comes after the storm, heavy and full of disbelief. One officer, a tall man with tired eyes, approached my dad and said, "Sir, we're gonna need your statement. You handled this well, but we need to piece it all together." Dad nodded calmly, no anger, no pride, just focus. He set his gun safely on the table, away from everyone, and said, "You'll find everything you need in their pockets. The badges, the fake IDs, the radios, all props." The officer blinked, surprised. "You figured that out before they broke in?" Dad gave a small nod. Their posture, their tone. Real officers never shout from outside the door like that. And real HOA inspectors don't carry sidearms or come at night. The officer jotted notes in his pad. "You've had training, haven't you?" Dad's answer was simple, almost distant. "Navy SEAL. Retired." That one sentence seemed to explain everything. The officer's pen stopped mid-air. "Well, sir, I guess they picked the wrong house tonight." In the corner of the room, I sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. Mom sat beside me, still trembling. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the cold reality of what had almost happened. I watched as crime scene techs snapped photos, the shattered doorframe, the scuff marks, the fake ID cards strewn across the floor. Each photo felt like a piece of proof that this wasn't a dream. After a while, another officer entered, older, wearing a sheriff's badge that gleamed under the light. He shook my dad's hand firmly. "Mr. Thomas, we've been tracking a crew that matches this pattern. They've hit 5 neighborhoods so far, fake HOA inspections, power cut, cell signal jammed. They target families, usually at night, to rob and intimidate." Mom gasped. "They've done this before?" The sheriff nodded grimly. "Yes, ma'am. But this time, they picked the wrong target. Your husband's actions probably stopped a string of break-ins we've been chasing for months." Dad didn't react much. No smile, no victory. Just quiet composure. He looked down at the broken door and said softly, "I just did what any man would do for his family." But I knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have known what to do under that kind of pressure, when seconds decide everything. Hours passed. Officers collected evidence, bagged the fake gear, and led the impostors away in separate cruisers. When the last car drove off, the neighborhood fell silent again. The only sound was the faint chirp of crickets and the soft hum of dawn creeping over the horizon. Dad walked outside, barefoot, standing on the porch steps. I followed him quietly. The morning air was cool, and the world looked different, smaller somehow, more fragile. He looked at the sky and said, "Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it wears a smile, a badge, even a uniform. That's why you never let your guard down." I didn't say anything. I just stood beside him, feeling safe in a way I never had before, not because of the gun or the police, but because of the man who stood between danger and us without hesitation. That night changed our house forever. The locks got replaced. Cameras went up. But the biggest change wasn't in the walls, it was in us. We learned that real courage doesn't shout or show off. It stands silently in the doorway when fear tries to break in, and doesn't move. The morning after felt unreal. The front door had been fixed with temporary hinges, but the cracks in the wood still showed like scars, silent reminders of the night fear came knocking. Mom brewed coffee, her hand steady now, though her eyes still searched every shadow. The house smelled of fresh paint and relief. But under it all, there was still that lingering sense of, what if? Dad sat at the kitchen table, reading the morning paper as if nothing had happened. He looked calm, almost peaceful, though the faint bruise on his forearm told a different story. A police cruiser stopped outside just after sunrise. The same sheriff from last night stepped out, hat tucked under his arm, paperwork in hand. "Morning, Mr. Thomas," he said, offering a respectful nod. "We've got good news." The 3 men confessed. Turns out, they were part of a small operation run by an ex-contractor. They used fake HOA credentials to gain entry, scout homes, and disable alarms. "You stopped them cold." Dad didn't smile. He simply nodded, taking in every word. "Justice served then," he said quietly. The sheriff smiled faintly. "Justice, and a bit of poetic irony. One of them said they picked your house because it looked quiet. Safe. Easy." Dad's eyes flickered, just for a moment. "Easy," he repeated softly, almost to himself. The sheriff tipped his hat and turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he stopped. "For what it's worth, sir, we've seen hundreds of these cases. Usually ends bad. But the way you handled it, controlled, smart, you probably saved more than just your own family." When he left, the house fell quiet again. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, catching dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. Mom finally spoke. "You're not going to tell the neighbors, are you?" Dad shook his head. "No point. The ones who need to know already learned something last night." I didn't fully understand then, but I do now. He meant that courage isn't about showing off. It's about being ready when the moment finds you, no matter who's watching. A few weeks later, the case went to trial. The men pleaded guilty to multiple charges: impersonation of law enforcement, attempted home invasion, and possession of illegal firearms. The judge didn't go easy on them. In the courtroom, I watched their faces, the same men who had pounded on our door at 3 a.m. pretending to have power. Now, stripped of their fake authority, they looked small, hollow, defeated. When the verdict was read, Dad didn't cheer. He just stood, nodded once, and quietly led us out of the courtroom. As we walked through the courthouse doors, he said something I'll never forget. Justice doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it walks in quietly, through the front door. That night, as we sat on the porch under a soft summer sky, the world finally felt calm again. The stars looked brighter, the air smelled cleaner, and the house, though still marked by that night, felt stronger somehow. I turned to Dad and asked, "Were you scared that night?" He looked at me, eyes thoughtful, and said, "Son, fear is natural. What matters is what you do after it shows up." Then he smiled, a small, knowing smile that said more than words ever could. And I realized that this story wasn't just about fake cops or a break-in. It was about truth versus disguise, courage versus fear, and a man who proved that real authority isn't worn on a badge, it's carried in the heart. So when people ask me why I don't fear the dark anymore, I tell them this. Because once, darkness knocked on our door pretending to be the law. And it met a Navy SEAL who didn't need a badge to stand for justice. And justice, it didn't shout. It came quietly, but it came through the front door.